I got lucky at a church sale recently. I found these two Drexel dining chairs for only $5 each. These were made by the Drexel Furniture Company, probably in the 1960s. These chairs are mostly made of solid walnut. An exception to that would be the back, which is a curved piece of plywood with a walnut veneer on the front and on the back. Here on the side, you can see the plies of the plywood. These diamond inlays are rosewood veneer, and I have a feeling that they're covering screws that go through the backrest and into the supports behind it, through this spacer piece. Most of the finish is in okay condition. There are some scratches and dings, but I think I can save most of the original finish, with the exception of the finish on the back. It's pretty grimy, and some of the finish has worn away, and some of it has just turned into a kind of a dark, sticky mess, which happens a lot on old chairs, especially in this area, because they get handled here a lot. So I'll just refinish the backrest and try to just freshen up the finish on the rest of the chair. There are a few loose joints that will need to be reglued, which is typical of chairs this old. And one of the chairs does have a crack that I'll need to glue up. I began by disassembling the chairs as much as I could. The first thing I did was to remove these nuts that were on a bolt that went through the back legs and through the glue block. Normally, if the chair didn't have any issues, removing these nuts shouldn't allow me to remove the back legs, because they're also glued to the rim of the seat by dowels that go from the seat into the legs. It's kind of hard to explain, but you'll see those dowels later on. Once I got the nuts off, then I could see the first issue with this side of the legs. The back leg should be glued to this block of wood. They should be one piece. So that glue joint has failed. So I'll have to fix that later. And then on this side, where the crack was, it turns out that it was cracked all the way through that piece of wood. So I'd have to fix that also. And here you can see where the crack happened. And there are 4 dowels that go into that piece of wood that cracked. These are the dowels that connect the legs to the seat. And this may be why it cracked. So they had to drill 2 big holes through this piece of wood to get those dowels in there. And that may have contributed to it cracking. When it was new and the glue on the dowels was still holding, it was probably fine, just as one big mass of wood all glued together. But maybe after a few decades, when the glue joint failed, then the leg was able to move around and wiggle, and when people would sit on the chair, probably put a lot of stress on that spot. And having those 2 big holes in there may have weakened it and made it crack. And then I had to take off the front legs, and these were just barely hanging on, so it was pretty easy to get them off. I first removed the screws from the glue blocks. And then gave it a few taps with a rubber mallet. And off it came. But once it came off, I did find a broken dowel, so I'd have to fix that later on. And then I disassembled any other parts that were loose. On this particular chair, the side pieces were loose. I started by removing the screws from the glue block, at least on the half of the glue block that was loose. Here you can see on this chair, there was a big gap between the side of the seat and the glue block. And it looked like it may have always been like that. The other side had a much better fit, and the block was right up against the side of the chair. So for this one, later on in the video, when I glue it back together, I'll put some shims in there to fill that gap. And once I got the screws out, the piece came out easily. It was very loose. And I did notice that there was a shim put in the joint right here, a very thin piece of wood to fill the gap. I guess it wasn't a very good joint at the factory. There must have been a small gap there, so they put this shim in to fill that space. Next, I had to glue this piece back together. This is the back leg that had cracked where those dowels were. Once I scraped off any old glue that was remaining, then I put on some new glue. And just clamped it up. Once the glue had dried, I ran a drill bit through the holes for the dowels just to clean up any glue that may have gotten in there when I glued the two pieces together. I wanted to make sure I had a nice clean surface in there for the glue to hold when I put the chair all back together. To fix this broken dowel, I first cut off any of the dowel that was left above the surface. And then I took a drill bit that was just a little bit smaller than the dowel, and I drilled into the dowel. And then I used a slightly larger drill bit and removed some more of the dowel with that. And then I chipped away at whatever was left of the dowel. But I only needed to go down maybe 1/8 of an inch, just so I had a nice clean hole up at the top. And then I could use the proper size drill bit for the hole. And I could just drill down into the hole, and that would take care of anything that was left of the dowel. There was a dowel on this piece that was loose but it wasn't loose enough to pull out easily. But I had to get it out so I could get some new glue in there before I put the chair back together. I didn't want to put the chair back together with this dowel being loose. And there are different ways to get the dowel out. You could try heating it up to soften the glue. That often works. But in this case, I tried a different method. I first cut off the part of the dowel that was above the surface, and then drilled a small hole, and inserted a screw. And then I used that screw, along with a hammer, to pull the dowel out. And then I could put some new glue in there and a new dowel. Next, I glued up the front leg assemblies. I put some new glue in the holes and on the dowels. But before I put the new glue on, I did scrape off any old glue residue that was left. I did have to put this long piece of wood in between the two legs when I clamped it up. Because of the way that the legs are shaped, the clamp wasn't contacting the whole surface of the leg. So the pressure that it was putting on the legs made them want to kind of fold inward. So to prevent that, I put this piece of wood in to resist that force and in turn keep that joint closed in the front. And then I was ready to start gluing the chairs back together. I started with this chair, which is not the one that had the cracks in the back. I just applied some new glue to the dowels and the dowel holes, and then put it all back together. Putting old chairs back together like this can be tricky, especially when it has a lot of odd angles like this chair does. It can be like trying to put toothpaste back into the tube. Sometimes the chairs just don't want to go back together the way they originally were. But I put it together as best as I could, and because of all the odd angles on this one, I used a strap as a clamp. I also put a small shim in between the seat and the glue block. This is the one that had the large gap in between the glue block and the seat. So I glued this shim in there to fill in that space. The plan was to only refinish the seat back and just the front side of the seat back. So to remove the old finish on that, I just scraped it with a utility knife blade. And once I scraped off as much as I could, I gave it a light sanding with 180 grit sandpaper, being careful not to go through the veneer. Then it was time to glue up the other chair, and this is the one that did have the crack in it that I showed in the beginning of the video. First thing I did was to put this back piece in, and I had to fix this joint here. This is the other joint I showed in the beginning of the video that's supposed to be one piece, but the glue joint had failed. So I just applied some new glue to both surfaces, and I used that bolt as a clamp. Once that had dried, then I glued up the rest of the joints. And used a strap again to clamp it up. And then I could put some new finish on the backs. I wasn't sure yet at this point whether I was going to need to use some stain or not. So the first thing I did was just to apply a thin coat of clear shellac to the backs. And this is Zinsser Seal Coat that I'm using. And this will give me a better idea of the actual color of the veneer. When there's no finish on it, you're really not getting an accurate view of what the color will be when there is finish on it. So this little bit of shellac helps bring out the color. And they look pretty good at that point. They are slightly different. The one on the right is a much plainer looking veneer than the one on the left, which has some nice stripes in it. And the color is slightly different. With the shellac on there, I could see that the color was just a little bit too light. I wanted to get it a little bit closer to the frame of the chair. So to do this, I applied some gel stain, and the color is antique walnut. Since I put that shellac on there, that sealed the veneer a little bit, so it won't absorb a lot of stain, but that's okay because I don't need it to. I'm not trying to make it a lot darker, just a little bit. And also, this is gel stain, which mostly sits on top of the wood anyway, as opposed to being absorbed into the wood. So I just wiped it on and then wiped off most of it, just left a little bit on there to darken it up a bit. Once the gel stain was dry, then I applied a few coats of an oil-based satin wipe-on polyurethane. And here they are, all finished. Most of the work I did was structural, so they don't actually look that different, but they are a lot sturdier now. Thanks for watching.